local Las Vegas. I'm a local Las Vegas resident, and I'm into birds. And I've been birding kind of intently here for about 3 years. And one of the more challenging birds for bird groups for me to identify has been flycatchers. So I am going to hopefully tonight give you some tools that have helped me identify some of these tricky birds. So let me share my screen here and get this going. Okay, so does everybody see flycatchers up on the screen? Is that what people are seeing?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. All right. But now I can't advance my thing. Let's see what's going on. Okay. So can people see some flycatchers here? Hopefully, 3 different ones pop up.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. I think we're rolling okay. So we're lucky here in Las Vegas that we actually have a number of different species of flycatchers. We've got the vermilion, the Say's phoebe, Cordean flycatchers. So we have quite a few of them. So what I'm going to do tonight, like I said, is I'm going to give you guys an identification toolbox. And these are ways that you can start kind of narrowing down what species it is. Even before you're actually looking at the individual field marks, there's a lot of things that you can take into account to help you. So when are they here? When do you see these flycatchers? Because we have different species here at different times of the year. So are they year round? Do you see them year round? Are they wintering here, breeding, migrating through in the spring and fall? And so if you look at the range map, so here's a western wood pewee, you can see that it spends most of its winter down in South America, and then it migrates up, and that's the blue is the wintering, the migrating is the yellow, and the orange is where it breeds. So you can see that it breeds here, and in fact, we have them in a number of different habitats. So kind of figuring out, okay, what species is here when will help you narrow it down a little bit. And then you have different habitat types. So we've got, are they found in the desert? Is that where you're seeing them up in the mountains in Mount Charleston, the Spring Mountains, or maybe down at Lake Mead near some water? So that is useful information in determining what species you might be seeing. Now, another one is behavior. What are the individuals doing? What are they doing with their body? All flycatchers, they have a good name because they like to fly from a perch and grab insects, usually in midair, sometimes on the ground, and they'll come back to the same perch. So here I have a western wood pewee, and it is gonna do its thing. It's looking around, grab something, and back. A nice tasty fly it looked like. So it's very nice for being able to try to identify them because they often come back to the same place, so you get a good look at them. And especially for me as a photographer, it's really nice because I can just train my camera on a stick and they'll come back and I can get some photos of them hopefully. Another tool that's really good is to listen to them. And a lot of people, including myself, use different sound apps that are available that you can download. There's several that are free. And the artificial intelligence is improving for these, but I would say that on average, flycatchers are able to be identified pretty well by these sound apps. And I think the reason for that is flycatchers generally have a very short sound, and I think it's just easier for the artificial intelligence to figure out what it is, compared to like a yellow warbler that has a very long call and can actually vary quite a bit from location. So I use that as a tool to help me figure out what the birds are. So let's go over some of the common ones that we have. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to delve into some of the real tricky ones. So one of the largest ones we have is the Western kingbird. And this bird has a gray back and head and a yellow chest and belly. And these guys are pretty big. They're about the size, a little bit smaller than a robin. And they're here during migration. We'll see them in the spring and fall, but they don't nest here. One species that we do have nesting here is the ash-throated flycatcher. You can see them in a number of different habitats. They're a really beautiful bird. They're a little bit smaller, and they have that kind of chestnut color on the primary wings, and on the tail is kind of brown. And then if you have a profile, the throat is very gray ash colored. And these guys will actually pick ants off the ground sometimes too. So you'll see them swoop down to the ground and grab different insects there. A bird that we have all year round here is the black phoebe, and they're very defined by their dark upper body and then their white belly. So you can see them, and they're usually associated with water is where I see them the most. You can find them inland away from water, but typically they kind of like water. So that's a good trick for identifying those guys. And then another bird that we have quite a bit here year round as well is the Say's phoebe. And they're kind of I don't know, maybe a little bit of a drab bird, but they have a sort of orangey breast on them, belly on them, I should say. And you can find them in a variety of habitats. And oftentimes you can find them in your backyard. These guys are pretty comfortable adapting to people. And then, of course, we have the vermilion flycatcher, which is such a striking bird. This is the male vermilion flycatcher. And, you know, I think we're kind of at the northern extent of their range, but we do have them in the winter, and they do breed in a few locations around. But typically I see them more kind of spring, fall. I guess in the winter I see a fair number of them. And this is one of the few flycatchers that we have where the male and female look different. Here is the female. It doesn't have quite it has a little bit of red sometimes under the tail by the wings, but a little drabber in color because, like all birds, she has to sit on the nest and incubate her eggs, and she doesn't conspicuous to predators. So she leaves the showy male to do his singing and flying around while she takes care of the kids. So, okay, so now we're going to go into a little bit more tricky ones. So I talked about the western wood kiwi, but there's another bird that we have that I think might breed in the spring mountains, but is usually more here in migration, which is the olive-sided flycatcher. And if you look at these two birds, there's a couple characteristics that help separate them. One is the head. Kind of the olive-sided flycatcher just has a bigger head in relation to its body. And also the bill, if you look at the bill, it's much bigger proportionally than the western wood kiwi. And then if you get a front view of the olive-sided flycatcher, they have what is described as a field mark as a vest. So they have this kind of gray with a yellowish white stripe in the middle. And so if you get a good frontal view like this, you can really see the difference between these two. So those are kind of two similar ones that can be tricky for folks. Okay, now we're going to delve into the ones that make a lot of birders scratch their heads, even the real expert birders. So the Pitamax flycatchers, AKA called the empids. And these are a group of very similar looking flycatchers. And they're smaller than the other ones that I showed. And some are here, they're here at different times of the year migrating, and some will actually breed here. So we'll go through them, but I saw this T-shirt on Amazon with this empid identification guide. And if you look at the shirt, if you look at the different birds and how they identified them, they're exactly the same. So they're kind of doing a little funny joke here, saying that, oh wow, all of these ones look look exactly the same, but that's not quite true. There are some ways of telling them apart. So let's start breaking it down a little bit. And so first thing we're going to do is look at some useful field marks to look at and kind of describe them. So we're all kind of using the same terminology. So the first thing to look at is the crown shape. So that is the top of their head, the feathers on their head. And is it round? Is it flattish? Is it peaked? Or is it crested? So that's one characteristic that I like to use, one field mark. Another thing is the eye ring. Some of them have this really big teardrop white eye ring. Some have sort of an eye ring that's a little bit messy. It's not very defined. Some of the eye ring is very crisp and bold. It's very defined on the edges. And some of them don't really have much of an eye ring at all, and it's kind of hard to see. So that's a really good field mark. And then another one, this one is also helpful if you have a camera to really look at it closely. But you can look at the primary extension of the primary feathers on the wing. And so some of them, this is in relation to the whole primary feathers. And so some have very short, you can see the one on the left, medium, and then a long primary extension in relation to the length of the wing there, the primaries of the wing. So that's a kind of a tricky one, but it can be helpful with a few of them. And then we get to the forehead angle. Do they have a shallow, so it kind of just tapers up? Is it really steep like the one on the right, so it goes right from the bill and kind of almost goes straight up, or is it kind of in between? So those are helpful to, as we'll see in a minute. So we'll start off with one that breeds here that we're seeing right now. I saw one at Corn Creek yesterday, and this is the Willow Flycatcher. So if you look at this, you can kind of start to look at some of the things that we talked about. And so the peak, so it has a fairly peaked crown, and it has a shallow forehead. It's not a very steep forehead. It has medium to large yellow to orange lower bill, so that's helpful. And then the primary extension that we talked about is kind of middle of the road. And the eye ring, though, you can't really see much of an eye ring on this guy. It's hard. It doesn't really have one. It's got a short tail. And the wing bars, so the white going across the wings, are kind of dull. They're not really very bright typically. And the song is very unique. This is a good one that most people can identify right off. They say Fitz Bew. So I have a recording of it here. So that's the Willow Flycatcher. So that one it's a little unique. It's a little easier, so we'll go with that one. Now we're gonna go a little bit deeper into the gray flycatcher. This one migrates through. It nests a little bit further north. It doesn't really nest here. And as you can see, it looks quite different than the willow. So for example, it has more of a rounded head, and this angle isn't so good to see the forehead, but it's kind of, it's also a little bit shallow, not that steep. It has a very large lower bill. It's also yellow or orange. And the primaries, if you look at them, are much shorter in comparison to the length of the whole wing. So the primary extension is much shorter. It's got a messy eye ring. You can see the eye ring, but it's not very well defined. It has a very long tail. And this one has, usually you can see very pronounced white outer tail feathers. Kind of dull in color. It's not that bright. And one of the great things is the behavior of this guy or this girl. They flick their tail towards the ground and then up. So they kind of flick their tail, but they start going towards the ground. So I remember gray flycatcher G, and then ground. So they flick their tail to the ground. That kind of helps me remember kind of what this one does. And then the call is a loud whit type note. And then the song, they sort of say chip it, and then they do that, sometimes followed by a rising tweet. So kind of a cool little song there. Well, we have one that looks very similar to the gray, and that's the Dusky Flycatcher. They breed in the spring mountains, and they look fairly similar to the gray flycatcher. They also have a rounded crown. They have a little steeper of a forehead. I kind of have trouble picking that one out, to tell you the truth. The bill is a little smaller, and usually the lower bill has a little bit of black color on it. Sometimes it's not completely black like this one, but it usually isn't completely yellow or orange either. It also has short primary extension of the primary feathers, an indistinct messy eye ring, dull wing bars. Also has a medium length tail, a long tail, but this guy will flick his tail up, then down. So that's really helpful at telling the difference between the gray and the dusky. And the call is very similar. It's a little bit softer, but it's also a whit call. And then the song is usually three-parted. Sometimes you can only hear two parts of it, and it's a little bit different than the gray the gray flycatcher. So let's give a listen. Yeah, so that one's quite a bit different than the gray song. So that's a good way. And even I was talking about the apps, and even though the call of these two sounded very similar, the apps that I've used have been able to identify it pretty easily. So even though to my ears, they don't really sound, the whit call of the gray and the dusky doesn't sound that different, the apps will actually usually be able to pick that up. But if you combine all the field marks you're seeing with the behavior of the tail flicking up, then down, you have like a number of things to help figure out what this bird is. Okay, we're getting down there. Now we have the Hammond's flycatcher. They migrate through, and I believe sometimes we can have a few of them nesting in the spring mountains, but they're more a spring and fall bird, and they look a little bit different. And they have a varied sort of crown. It could be rounded or it can be peaked. They can raise it, but they have a much steeper forehead. It's not as shallow angled as the others that we've looked at. And it has a much smaller bill. And usually the lower bill is completely dark. So if you look at that bill, it's much smaller than the other ones. And now the primary extension, if you look at the right wing, it's not as prominent. I think it's the way the bird's holding its wing. But if you look at the left wing, it's much longer than the gray or the dusky or even the willow flycatcher. So that's a good characteristic for this bird. They also have a bigger eye ring. It's a little bit messy. It's not very neat, but it's a little bigger. And they have a short and fairly narrow tail, definitely shorter than the dusky or the gray. And the wing bars, those white lines going across the wings, are usually a little bit brighter as well. And its call is a peep. And then the song is usually 2-3 parts. It's a quick split with a a husky chirp, and then followed up by a chirp. So I never quite, some of those, the English sort of phrasing of the bird's song, it doesn't work for me that well, but if that works for you to remember, let's listen to it. And that, I just had a short little bit of that one. I don't know if it did the chillip on the end of that one. I think it was just doing the first two parts of that one. All right, now these are the last two that we're going to do. There's two flycatchers that used to be called the Western Flycatchers, but then they split them. They thought they were one species, but they were actually two. So we have the Cordilleran Flycatcher, and then the Western was also split into the Pacific Slope Flycatcher. And I'm kind of joking with you here a little bit. I just flipped the slides. These are actually both Cordilleran Flycatchers, but they're almost impossible. Even people that like say are banding birds and will catch them in the net, they have a hard time identifying them. So really the only way to identify these guys is by their calls and songs. So let's give it, and you can also identify them. I talked about the first thing was by their location. We have the Cordilleran Flycatchers, they breed in the spring mountains, they're a little bit more inland, and the Pacific Slope are closer to the West Coast, more in California, they go up to Washington. So their range is also different. But in migration, we can sometimes get both of them here in Las Vegas. So let's listen to them. Okay, so here's the Cordilleran Flycatcher, I think, first. But oh yeah, I forgot. Let's separate them from the other flycatchers though. So they have a very big crested crown, and they have a medium sloped forehead. They have a medium-sized bill, and it's always orange on the lower bill. They have medium primary extension. They have a very distinct teardropped eye ring, kind of that white that goes behind the eye. So this one is very different than the other flycatchers we've seen. They have a medium length tail. And like I said, the Cordillerans breed in the spring mountains. And so here is their call. And the call of the Cordilleran is, if you listen carefully, it's a little bit of a two-part, whereas the Pacific Slope Flycatcher sort of sounds more single syllable. So let's listen to this. So this is the Cordilleran. Okay, so now let's listen to the Pacific Slope. Maybe you only have. So let's. I think that's a slightly different pitch, and it's more just like one continuous note. And once again, the apps I found have been pretty good with these at defining them, deciding which species it is. So I will use those. And if you see someone that says, oh yeah, I could identify the field marks just by looking at it to separate these two, I mean, even the experts kind of shy away from doing that. They listen to the song, or they listen to the calls and the songs to separate them. Okay, so those are all the flycatchers we're gonna do today, but I have a quiz for you, okay? So I'm gonna give you two mystery birds and see if you can come up with what they are. You can just write it down on a piece of paper, keep it in your mind, and we'll go through them. Okay, so the first one is this one. Okay, so look at the bill size, the bill color, the crown, the feathers on the top of the head, kind of the angle of the forehead, the primary extension, the length of the tail. Yeah, okay. So this one's a little tricky, and I also have a song for you. So let's see if we can remember some of the songs. So I'll play the song now. Okay. All right. Let's go. Well, let's just do them one by one. What do people think? Why don't you? I know we muted the calls, but I guess I'll just go through them. That would be the best thing to do. So for me, like I went through all those things, and it's down to one of two birds. And the two birds would be the gray flycatcher and the dusky. And to tell you the truth, I'm not 100% sure on this bird, but the call that I heard was that of a gray flycatcher. And when I observed it, I should have told you the behavior too. That I left that out. Sorry. The behavior was it was flicking its tail down to the ground and then up. But the confusing things on this one for me is you can't really see the white outer tail feathers. Remember I mentioned that? And also the primary extension, I guess they're short. I might construe them as medium length. And there's a little bit of black on the tip, very tip of the lower bill. So, but the sound, put it away for me, and also the behavior. So let's do mystery bird number 2. Okay. So this one has a very exaggerated crown, feathers on the top of the head. The forehead, I can't really tell because of the head-on shots. I'm not going to talk about that. But the bill, sort of a medium-length bill, and this one is all orange on the bottom. And then the eye ring is very pronounced. I would call it a teardrop eye ring. And the primary extensions are kind of medium. Tail is sort of medium length. No behaviors that I noticed, but let's listen to the sound. Okay, so based on that sound, sort of sounded a little bit 2-syllable, a little bit higher in pitch. So this is a Cordilleran flycatcher, one of the last ones I showed. So that is the end of the presentation, and hopefully it didn't overwhelm you and intimidate you. You can work on them a little bit at a time, and have fun out there. Use the apps with the sound to try to help you a little bit with the songs and the calls. And then have a good friend that can identify them a little bit better than you can to start you off. It's very helpful as well. So great.
Thank you, David. There were 2 people asked the same question. And that is, what is the difference between a call and a song?
Right. So that's a good question. Both the male and the female will do the calls, but the song is done in most species just by the male. And so the male is doing 2 things when it does its song. It is staking out its territory where it's going to live, and it's also attracting females, and it's kind of defending that territory from other males. So that's the difference there. So good question.
And typically, David, I think we hear the songs during the breeding season, right?
Right. Another key thing. Yeah, you're not going to hear them singing. Sometimes in migration, maybe in late spring, but usually it's just when they're on their nesting habitats. So the calls can be heard all year round, but usually the breeding season is when you're hearing, yeah, the songs. The calls can be all year round. Yeah.
Yeah, on something on that, a variation I think David taught me is that, like, if we were up at Mount Charleston right now, maybe a few weeks ago, it would have been really, really, noisy, right? We kind of call, and we think there are all these birds up there, and then 2-3 weeks later, it's really quiet, and I sometimes think they're all gone, but
Yeah.
when they're now have laid their eggs and they're tending to their chicks, they will not talk, right?
Yeah.
They're still there. They just
they're definitely there, and especially once the birds hatch out of the eggs, the parents, whether it's both parents or just the female, they've got a lot of work to do. They don't have much time to be singing or even calling. They're like trying to get food for their growing brood. So that's another thing. Birds are just quieter. Like you'll hear them singing in the morning, and then here it gets real hot, and it's amazing how the birds are still pretty much all there. They're just hiding in cool places during the day, and there's not tons of vegetation here, but they're good at hiding, and you don't see them. But the next morning they're out in the beginning of the breeding season, singing away and yeah, being more present.
Other questions? Yeah, I would also encourage, you have lots of many photographers here. I think for all of us, when we started birding, we are now, we have tools like these zoom cameras, bridge cameras, and they're really helpful to help you take some photos. And when you get home, you just take these tips that David has shown and just go through each one of those because you're going to see the bird move. So it give you different angles. It may not be a photo that you will send to National Geographic, but it's really helpful for us to learn. Yeah, just so I think Jennifer said, just set it on I don't know how many shots, and just keep pushing the button. Right?
Fire away.
And many shots as you possibly can.
I think this is,
go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, this is going to help me define more than just, oh, look, a gray bird. So I'm excited to try this out.
And like I said, the flycatchers are neat because like the Say's Phoebe is a very suburban flycatcher. You can see them right in your backyard, and they're great because they'll sit on a branch, and if it's a good spot to catch insects, they'll come back and look for them and fly out and come back. And so compared to like warblers that are like in the trees all over the place, moving fast, and smaller birds, flycatchers can be a little bit easier, I think, to identify. So yeah.
And CJ, the reason why this is a first one, so we're testing this. David also put together this kind of a presentation structure so that we hope that the toolkit is something that you will use for all species, right? You just are using the same way as those field marks. David started from the top of the head and work your way down. It's the same technique. If you can master this process, it'll help you cut through. And right now with Say's Phoebes and things like that, just use that same technique. Don't just say, "Oh, I know that one. That's a Say's Phoebe." Just continue to learn this identification process.
Get it embedded.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a lot of things in life when you don't do it for a while. So like in the wintertime, we don't have too many flycatchers, but in the spring they start coming in, and I gotta like dredge up those brain cells from my brain that kind of remembers how to tell them apart. So each year I have to like listen to the songs and the calls again and look at the field marks to help me figure out what they are. And that's, part of learning is kind of relearning and fine tuning. So
cool. So we have a question, David. Is that, the question is, when they split the Western flycatcher, does that mean that there are two new species and can't reproduce with each other?
That is not 100% true. Just because they're separate species doesn't mean that they couldn't potentially interbreed. And it depends on the species. A prime example of a bird that we have here in Lake Mead is we have the Clark's grebe and the Western grebe. They're large grebes with they're white and black, and they're separate species, but they can also interbreed. I'm not sure about these two. I'd have to look that up and see if the Cordilleran and the Pacific Slope can interbreed. I would think so, but I don't necessarily know that they can. And I think now, I don't know, Doug, you might know more about this than me, but I think the way they split things is pretty much through DNA these days. Mm-hmm. And in the past, they didn't have that technology, so they would look at the range and then the field marks. So now they have that tool as well.
Yeah.
So, but they are like fairly separated in their breeding range. I should look at the range map for their wintering. I bet they're kind of in the same place maybe for wintering, but they definitely occupy different areas when for nesting habitat.
Yeah, you definitely, David, it depends on how different is the DNA, and also how much time do they spend together in a particular habitat.
Yeah.
Let's see, there's somebody else in the chat. Morgan said, thank you, David. Any other questions? So I'm also recording these questions so that we'll post this particular recording and you can go back, because like I say, it's really hard to remember teardrops, head shapes and all that. So David, that's really helpful. George says, what do they eat?
Yeah, they can eat a variety of different things, but I'm trying to think, I don't know, Jennifer, maybe you could, you've been to the orchard at Corn Creek quite a bit. I don't think I've seen them eating much plant material. I don't know, because like I've seen a lot of, so people that haven't birded at Corn Creek, they plant these mulberry trees, and in the springtime during migration, all these birds come, and in one tree you can have these warblers that usually eat mostly insects eating the mulberries because they're such a calorie-rich food. But I can't remember ever seeing the flycatchers do that. I think they're catching mostly insects. Yeah.
Yeah, and also for the young, they love caterpillars. Anything with a lot of calories.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do we access the recordings?
So there are a few online things that you can access for free. So my go-to is there's a website called allaboutbirds.org, and that has everything. It has pictures of the birds, photographs of the birds, and male, female imatures. It has range maps, and it has songs and calls. And that's my go-to, but there are a number of them. The Sibley Field Guide also has an online presence and also an app that you can use. There's also the Merlin app, which is, I think, by Cornell. That's a free app for your phone, and that has all that same information as well. So there's a number of online tools and apps for your phones to do that, to look up that information. And there's also, do you know the name? There's a website just for sounds, animal sounds, specifically bird sounds. I think these are Z. Is that?
Yeah, it's called Xenocanto.
Yeah, and that is helpful because and these other apps will often have where the bird is recorded, because sometimes, like I mentioned, you can have variation in the sound. Like I'm from the East Coast, and when I hear a common yellowthroat here, they sound very different than a common yellowthroat in the East Coast. So it's helpful to look at where they recorded the bird sound. So I'm looking for one that was recorded maybe in Arizona will sound like the one here in Nevada versus one that was recorded in Michigan. So yeah, so that'll help. And I didn't talk about it in the slide, but there's also the sonogram. So it's the visual interpretation of the sound. And I'm actually much more a visual person than an auditory, and seeing what the sound looks like helps me identify it. So that's another thing to use.
Yeah. So CGS comments, all our bird, yes, it's part of the Cornell system. I think Kathy, you said you wanted to know how to access the recordings in terms of this presentation. Is that?
Well, this is going to be on YouTube, right? So you could.
Yeah, it's recorded. So we'll post it. We have a YouTube channel, and we just, Morgan and Andrea and I will try to figure out what's the most efficient way for you to access this recording.
Yeah, so that's probably the best way to do that.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, other questions? David, thank you. So we are thinking with David is that maybe the next two kind of sessions, one could be small sandpipers, because we have the fall migration probably going to start in a few weeks, and those little sandpipers will come to our ponds. So maybe that would be a good one. And I think that the third one, David and I have been bouncing around, is sparrows, right? Sparrows, they kind of look very much like each other.
I could use a sparrow session. Yeah.
Okay. So, okay.
This is great. Thank you.
Any other kind of things, just let us know. We'll not just David, but we're going to ask other expert birders in our area to put together and participate in presenting these challenging topics. So,
thank you very much. Thank you.
This has been great. I really enjoyed it.
Oh,